Hello, everyone. I'm uploading here on this video a class that I taught last year. I called it Five Great Words or Concepts of the Book of Genesis. I based it on my translation of Genesis from the Transparent English Bible. You can get it on Amazon. I think many of you have heard me talk about it before. I've done interviews, some of them are up on YouTube. But this one uses the translation to focus on what I think are five of the very unique, forgotten, and neglected aspects that you find conceptually within the book of Genesis. I'm a historian of ancient religions. I work on everything from the ancient Near East through the Hebrew Bible to early Christianity, ancient Judaism, all the way down into church history and Christian origins. But my focus, as most of you know, is really on the Hellenistic period and on Christian origins. And these five ideas that I cover are so different from the ideas that developed later within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the three Abrahamic faiths, that they've largely been discarded and left behind. And I think it's interesting to go back and pick them up. And they really form a basis for understanding how the idea of resurrection of the dead developed and how that's really different from the dualistic idea of the immortality of the soul that basically took over the world. So listen to the lesson and keep in mind that whatever I'm presenting, whether it's Dead Sea Scrolls or the Hebrew Bible or Jesus or Paul or anything that I present, I try to do it in terms of what are the set of ideas and how do they hold together.
And today I'll be talking about great words in Genesis, the book of Genesis. I'm going to use this translation of mine quite a bit, as you'll see, because it's very literal and very exact from the words, in connection with the words, on the basis of the words. And you might know this, that the word in Hebrew, davar, means matters. So when I say I'm going to talk about the five great words, or not but five great words in Genesis, in the opening of the first three Torah readings, you could also say the five great matters, as almost many of you know, I'm sure. When we talk about the 10 Commandments, that's an old English translation that goes back to the 1500s. There are a few translations that put words. So the 10 words are the 10 matters. So when I talk about five great words here, it's five great matters or things or subjects or concepts. That's what I want to deal with. The first one here, and assuming everybody can see the screen, zoom in or make it full screen if you can't. In Hebrew, I give you the Hebrew. If you can't read Hebrew, you've got the transliteration, nefesh kaya, okay? Genesis 1:20 is where it first occurs. I'm interested really in the word nefesh, but nefesh kaya means a living nefesh. There's such a thing as a dead nefesh. So that should tell you what a nefesh is as we go further into it. It can either be living or dead. But if it's living, it's nefesh kaya, kaya. Genesis 1:20, and God said that the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the firmament of heaven. I picked the RSV because that's just the standard normal translation, going back in many cases to the American Standard and the King James. And it's okay. There's nothing wrong with it, really, except when I say bring forth, when you can say swarm a swarm, I think that's a lot better. But here's our word here. I put the key words in blue. A living life breather. So a nefesh is a life breather. It actually refers to the neck where you breathe. And fish also are nefesh because they breathe through the gills. They're living life breathers. All creatures on the earth are living life breathers. So here we have my translation, and Elohim said, let the waters swarm a swarm of living life breathers, and let the flyer fly upon the land, upon the face of the expanse of the skies. There's a lot in these translated verses we're going to cover that I could comment on, but I'm going to skip that or try to restrain myself here and just focus on the key words. So this right here, living life breather, is nefesh kaya. And literally, I translate it, it's living and it's a life breather. So as I said, you can have a dead nefesh. If an animal is killed or a human is killed, that body is still a life breather, but it doesn't have life and it's not breathing. We talk about the breath of life departing and somebody breathing their last breath, and then they're dead. So nefesh is basically a breathing creature. And here it's talking about fish. Verse 24, and let the land make a living life breather go out. I'm being very literal here. It literally says, let the land put forth, or let it go out of the land as it emerges literally from the land. And then 2:7, and this is the big point that gets so misunderstood. And Jehovah Elohim, we'll talk about those words later, shaped the soil creature. That's the word for the human. He's made of soil, Adam, Adamah, dust from the soil, and he blew into his nostrils breath of life. Hold that one for a minute. And the soil creature became a living life breather. So humans, land animals, and fish and birds are all living life breathers. Same word in Hebrew. And it's very important as we go on. We're going to do the next one, which is the breath of life. Let me go forward. And you can see here this nishmat, from nasham to pant or to puff. It's very, very similar. If nefesh is a life breather, in other words, I point at an animal, a fish, a human, and say, you're this thing that breathes life or air, then now you have the Lord God, that's actually the divine name, Yahweh or Jehovah. Jehovah God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. That's the RSV. Living being is not bad, but the King James used to say living soul. And it was the only time soul occurred in this chapter, and boy, did that lead people astray, and still is leading people astray, because they think, well, humans have the breath of life, and so they're living souls. They have an immortal soul. And those animals, those poor animals, they just breathe air. What I want you to see is this term, nishmat, is the word breath. It's the thing the nefesh breathes. So it's literally just breath. Here's my translation in the TEV. And Jehovah Elohim shaped the soil creature. It's not create. It's literally like in clay. You shape it. Dust from the soil. And he blew into his nostrils nishmat chaim. It's actually plural. Often you talk about life as lives. It's a way of emphasizing it, just like El and Elohim, which we'll get to in a minute. And the soul creature became a living life breather. Now that's that word nefesh kaya. So I know I'm just kind of speaking Hebrew here, but there's two words. There's nefesh kaya, a living breather, and then there's the nishmat chaim, the breath of life that you put into the living breather, so that one is a living breather. Without this breath of life, the soul creature would not be a living life breather. He would be a potential life breather. So that step one is make the nefesh, in this case a human being, and step two is breathe into his nostrils the nishmat chaim, the breath of life. Notice here in Job 27:3, I'm just going down the line. I don't have a cursor on this screen, but you can just follow me by looking. Job says, as long as my breath is in me and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils. Now here, spirit ruach can mean wind. And it's used for wind all the time. If you're talking about a windstorm or wind blowing, it's ruach. And spirit, the word spirit, especially when you put a capital S on it and talk about the Spirit of God, it's taken as this entity really that is separate from the wind, but it's really an attempt to describe the invisible force, you might say. But here you see a very literal use that's just like Genesis. In other words, this is not what people call the Holy Spirit in your nose, in your nostrils. It's exactly here. God breathes this nishmat kaya into Adam's nostrils, and then he becomes a living breather. And here Job is saying, as long as I'm got the breath and the spirit, which is this, it's Hebrew parallelism, the breath in me, the Spirit of God in my nostrils. You see the idea? It's the same thing. Now, when the flood comes, everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life. That's the RSV. Now, notice this. It's interesting because in the Hebrew, this is my translation, everything in whose two nostrils, very literal, two nostrils, was the breath of a spirit of life. Very similar to this text in Job. Breath, spirit, breath of a spirit of life. So the breath comes in, and this is everything who breathe, every living creature that breathes. And this is all the creatures. And only, according to Genesis, only 8 were humans who were saved in the ark, right? And then here you have the animals coming toward Noah, and one of the sources for the flood, toward the vessel, 2 by 2 from all flesh, in which is a spirit of life. So there you have the same thing, the nishmat kaim, the spirit of life, or the breath of life. You see how it's being used in a double way. Here's some other texts that tell what happens if you lose that spirit of life. God tells Adam, in the sweat of your nostrils you will eat bread until you return to the soil from it you were taken, for dust you are, and toward dust you will return. So that's an exact reverse of Genesis 2:7. Look up above. You shape the soil creature into a nefesh kaya, a living breather, breathe into its nostrils the breath of life. It becomes a breathing, living life breather. And here you return to the soil because your dust and spirit leaves. Here's a better description of the leaving of the spirit. This doesn't mention that. This is more the body. When his breath departs, he returns to his earth. There you go. And on that very day, his thoughts perish. And the word thoughts is plans, activities, literally like doings. His doings perish. He's taken out. He's when you die, you're out of commission, so to speak. This is so opposite from the Greek view that develops in the Hellenistic world, that the body is nothing, and what really counts is an immortal soul that's imprisoned within the body. It's the real life, and if it could get out, then the soul could live forever and has this inherent immortality. Some of you studied this before, but I think it's the most common idea that I can think of that people hold, that somehow basically the breath of life or the living soul is an entity when it's actually a process. You understand? If you're living, you're breathing, you're alert, you're doing things. If you're dead, you go back to the dust. Your breath departs, your spirit departs, and you're dead. And your plans or your doings stop. They perish. Whenever people die suddenly, that's the first thing you think of, what they could have done, and that perishes. Ecclesiastes 3:19 shows that there is a transition going on where some people are saying, well, maybe the spirit of humans is different than the spirit of animals. And the writer, this is called Kohelet in Hebrew, he says the fate of the sons of men, human beings, and the fate of beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. That is the Genesis 1 and 2 story, as we see in the text. So this great word, nishmat kaya, is this breath of life that we receive at our birth when a newborn baby takes that first breath of life and begins to be then a breathing nephesh. Doesn't mean they're dead before that, because we know it's basically oxygen that's supplied by the mother. But once you're independent of the mother and of the umbilical cord, you will die very quickly unless you then take in the breath of life. We all know that. They all have the same breath, and humans or man has no advantage over the beast. All is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust and turn to dust again. So where do people go when they die? They go back to the dust. Then notice this, I put it in italics. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes downward? Because what's being suggested here, and this is very, very late, as the Hellenistic world is beginning to impact and influence the ancient Near Eastern world, that, well, maybe humans, their spirit is an immortal soul, and it probably goes up, and the spirit of beasts goes down because they're not that important. This I just put in because I love the phrase that's used twice in Numbers, that El is the God, the El of the spirits of all flesh, and that would be the breath of all flesh. So that's our second word. So nefesh kaya, nishmat kayim, the breath of life. Let's go to the next one. Now this one we're very familiar with, and here's a combination of several. You've got Elohim that comes from El. So here's the famous verse, Genesis 1:1, in my transparent translation. At the first of Elohim creating the skies and the land was desolation and emptiness, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the spirit, that's literally the ruach, the wind of Elohim, was hovering over the face of the waters. So you had this wind sweeping over the waters. And Elohim said, let there be light. And there was light. Vayahi or, kind of like, let there be light, like that. Now, there are other terms, but El, I think most of you are familiar with. Elohim is the plural. I usually tell my students it's something like saying the force, El is force or power, the force of all forces, it's plural. Some people call it the plural of majesty. In other words, it's all force. And we're going to get to naming the force in a minute. So humans are living breathers with the breath of life in them. And El, or Elohim, is the force of all forces. Seems to be self-generated, so to speak. And Genesis 1:1, I pointed this out before, it's not really about the words here, but it's not about when there was nothing, something was brought into being, but it's about the force of all forces beginning to work with the land and the skies on this planet. And it really isn't about the creation of the universe. I know that surprises people, but it's very clear. It doesn't mention, it does mention the stars and so forth that would be visible to us, particularly the galaxies. But the whole focus is on the Earth itself. I said the galaxies, particularly in our solar system. But to ancient people, they would look up and see the planetary spheres, and they would see the sun and the moon, and they were all seen to be these forces. But this is the force of all forces. Then there is El Elyon, which is the force most high. It's another way of saying the force of all forces. What's really interesting about the force of all forces is that there's plural, but it takes a singular verb. So when it says at the first of the force of all forces, creating the skies and the land, it's a singular verb. We say God created, Elohim created. So it's plural, but you use a singular verb. So that means it's this composite force of all forces. El Elyon is the same idea. I love this section of Genesis where Melchizedek, an ancient priest of the Most High God, El Elyon, literally El God, Elyon, the highest God. Like there can be a lot of forces, all the way down to humans are called Elohim, judges, but they're not the Most High El. So this is the Most High El, or El Elyon, King of Salem. He takes bread and wine. He was a priest to El Elyon. This is not the name Yahweh or Jehovah. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram to El Elyon, to the Most High God, the one possessing skies and land." Genesis 1 again. If he orders and creates the skies and the land, and of desolation and emptiness brings order and form and pulsating life on this beautiful planet which we inhabit, then clearly he is the possessor. It's actually the word koneh, which means to possess, to buy, to own. In modern Hebrew prayers, you say Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech haolam, King of the universe. The idea of being king, ruling. This is more direct, possessing everything. And blessed be El Elyon, who's enclosed your oppressors in the land. If you look up that story in Genesis 14, the people on the tour got it firsthand because Abraham goes all the way up to Dan in the far north, and we saw the gates. They call them the gates of Abraham just because it's mentioned that he goes up there. But they're the gates from the Canaanite period that are dating from that period. So this idea of El Elyon, and then you have El Shaddai. El Shaddai, Genesis 17:1 is the way God introduces himself to Abraham. He says, "I am El, force, Shaddai." So what is Shaddai? It's basically the word shad it's a plural, but it either means a breast or nipple, to succor or comfort, and it also can mean to destroy or to protect. It's a very interesting Hebrew word. So it, depending on the context, and I love the idea that it might even be combined here. El Shaddai would be God the protector and the nurturer. You picture like this against the breast, maybe a small child, either nursing or being comforted and also guarded. And this is the name that occurs throughout Job and another of the older texts of the Hebrew Bible. Let's see, I put Psalm 42 and 83 are called the Elohim Psalms. Why are they called the Elohim Psalms? Because they generally don't use what we refer to often as the Yod-He Vav-He, the divine name. They tend to use Elohim. You should read them. They're very interesting. In other words, you go from 42, which is book 2 of the Psalms, all the way up to 83. And it's almost Elohim, all Elohim, Elohim, Elohim. Many of you know Psalm 51 by heart. Notice it says, "Have mercy on me, O Elohim, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy." That's this psalm that David wrote after his adultery with Bathsheba and essentially murdering or arranging for Uriah to be killed. And he refers to Elohim. The Moses scroll that Ross has written about, and we've talked about a lot in the last year or so, it uses Elohim. It's the older primitive form of the force of all forces. But these psalms are very interesting because I'm not saying they never use Yod-He Vav-He, sometimes they do, but primarily they use Elohim. I think we don't tend to think of Elohim as a name, but more as a description, like, oh, that's God, but what is his name? But actually, these are names as well. Think of name as designation, descriptive designations, and you're trying to describe the ultimate force of the universe from an ancient Near Eastern perspective, which is somewhat limited, looking up at the skies, looking up at the stars and the planets, and the moon and the sun and so forth, and then saying, how is all of this ordered? How is all of this arranged, and what's it all about, and so forth? And the answer would be, well, the force of all forces. Now, what the next slide is about, so now we've got the name of God, Elohim, Elohim, Aloha. These are different forms of the name. So here's the one where people get confused. Yod-He Vav-He, the Tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God. There is in the Jewish prayer book a hymn. Here's my Jewish prayer book. It's called Adon Olam, and I put it right here. I changed the order a bit, but what it says is Hu Yehiyeh, Hu Hoveh, Hu Hayah. He will be, he is, he was. Those sounds, literally Yehiyeh, Hoveh, Hayah, those actual verbs in Hebrew are forms of the verb to be. So Yod-He Vav-He, my understanding of it, and here I think some of you read Nehemiah Gordon and other people that have talked about this, is essentially this phrase that is given in Exodus 3 when Moses says, okay, you're a force of all forces, but what do I call you? And what I want to point out here, because I think too many people think of this as a mantra or a set of syllables, like you need to get the name right. What you need to get is the concept right, because the concept, if you say, what is God's name? And I say, I will be what I will be. Say, well, that's not a name. Yes, it is. What he says in Exodus here is literally, I will be what I will be. The King James even puts I am, which is kind of interesting. The Hebrew is in the imperfect. So probably in English, I will be what I will be is better. But I am, if you always were and you always will be and you are now, you could just say pure being. That's what a philosopher would say. Paul Tillich talked about the ground of all being. He was actually picking up on this biblical idea that develops within the Hebrew Bible. I think the Hebrews are one of the only cultures, if not the only, that refuse to personify Elohim in these texts as they developed with the name of an object or a thing. So the God of the land, the God of the mountain, the God of the sea, the God of sickness, the God of healing, the God of anything you could name. What names do is they designate objects, right? So obviously, to be simple, a book, a piece of paper. So you say, what is that? It's paper. Well, what is Elohim of Elohim, the force of all forces? Name it. Name the force of all forces. You can't name it. In other words, what I'm saying is Yod-He Vav-He is not a name. It's a description that is essentially saying it can't be named, meaning it can't be limited. The rabbis talk a lot about this in various texts. So here you have, I'll just say Yehovah, because in Hebrew, that's the sound of it. Yeh, he will be. Ho, Hoveh, he is. And Hayah, Va, so Yehovah. As long as you understand that that's what it is, and not just a magic name that if you say it right, Yehovah. Sometimes people say, well, you said Jehovah and there's no J in Hebrew. Well, I'm speaking English. There is a J in English. And if I say Jacob, you say, well, you can't say Jacob, you got to go Yaakov. Well, if I'm speaking Hebrew, I'll say Yaakov. But if I'm speaking English, I'll say Jacob, or I might even say my own name, James, which is Jacob in English. You see? So it's not a magical formula. It's not a mantra, as some people think, that you got to just pronounce it a certain way. People even disagree on how to pronounce it. But the meaning seems clear. Even scholars, and the majority of scholars, would say Yahweh. Yahweh is probably the best translation. That's also the third person imperfect of the verb to be. It's like saying he will be, and it's picking up on I will be what I will be. So whether you say Yahweh or Yehovah or Jehovah, in a sense, you're naming. Here he says, what is your name? But he says, this is my name, and thus I am to be remembered. But remembered is this word zikron, which means my memorial or my way of describing myself. In other words, if you want to think of the force of all forces, you can go, I tell my students, just say it fast, will is was. If you want a name, literally that would be the feeling in English, will is was. And then you break it down. What is the force of all forces? The thing that will be and is and was. So here is my translation. I will be what I will be. That's really the name. In other words, that's not different from Yod He Vav He. It's an explanation. Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. I will be what I will be. I am. I will be. I am, and so forth. And many of you know this, but some people don't. And they talk about the sacred name. And what is the sacred name? How about the sacred concept? Remember that words are matters or concepts. Okay. And I'm actually going to try to stay within an hour here. Wow. Now, here I'm using two words, zedekah and mishpat. And I'm kind of counting as one concept. In the verse, I give it in the RA here, and here I'm giving it in my translation. So let me just skip to the chase and use mine, because using LORD, all caps, is not really the best, I think, for clarity. And will is was, or the force of all forces that we can't name and call pure being, okay, you get my drift, said, will I cover from Abraham? We say hide. I love the literalness. I'm going to cover this. Say, what are you doing? I'm covering it. I'm not telling. Will I cover from Abraham what I'm doing? For Abraham will be, surely he'll be. I love the Hebrew where it repeats it. I think the English just says, seeing that Abraham will become. That doesn't give you the feeling. I want an exclamation mark. For Abraham will be, surely he will be, for a nation large and strong, and all the nations of the land will be blessed. So Abraham is called a goy, and the goyim. People today say goyim and Israel, there's a difference there, but Abraham's household is also a nation or a goy, blessing the goyim, meaning all the other nations or tribes, or we would probably like the word clan better today. Now notice here, I have known him. RSV says I've chosen him. I'm not emphasizing that now, but I want you to see the literal meaning. I have known him so that he may charge his sons or children, really is the meaning, and his house after him, to guard the way of will is was, pure being, the Elohim of Elohim. I'm piling these up together by doing justness and judgment. So zedekah and mishpat. They almost sound the same when you say righteousness, right judgment, something's right. Zedekah is even used for alms today. But really the idea, I think, is that justness is more your behavior. Like when we say do the right thing, was that the right thing to do? Was that tzedakah? Well, look at the world today. Look at all the nations, even look at Abraham's nation, nation of Israel spread throughout the world, too many to count, scattered and lost and so forth, as well as the people we would recognize as the Jewish people. Is the behavior of everybody right and correct? You go to the 10 words and you get a breakdown of right behavior: property rights, sexual purity, taking things that aren't yours, taking life, and so forth and so on. But here, that would be justness, tzedakah. Mishpat is usually used for judges making the right choice or decision. When you think about somebody else, what sort of judgment do you place upon them? Everybody knows the famous words of Jesus of Nazareth, who said, don't do mishpat in a way that doesn't recognize that you also will have mishpat done to you. The sort of rule of reciprocation working there. And so this is part of mishpat. It's found in various Jewish sources as well. So the idea would be that the entire world would be filled someday with mishpat and tzedakah, people doing the right thing and people judging and behaving the right way towards others. And they kind of do overlap, but it's an interesting combination. And notice it's called the way, the derek. The derek of Yehovah or Yahweh or Jehovah is to do justness and judgment. It's an incredible package. I just wanted to point out, and then I'll conclude, one other thing. In chapter 18, where three men, this is the beginning of the chapter, it's not part of my lecture today or class, whatever you want to call it. You have these three men come to Abraham, and he's sitting in the door of his tent, and it's the heat of the day, and he's down in the desert where I just was a few days ago. And one of those men is then spoken of as Yehovah. And in three verses, verses 3, 27, 30, and 32, originally the text read Yod He Vav He, but the Masoretic text puts in Adon, Lord, because the anthropomorphic nature of the text is just too much. You know, you've got Yod He Vav He eating a meal, talking to Abraham, walking with Abraham, saying that I, Yehovah, will call fire from Yehovah on the earth and so forth. This has to do with Sodom and Gomorrah. So there's 134 places where the scribes, the Sopharim of the Masoretic text, change the divine name. Now, this is not like they hide it. They tell you, we are here putting Adon. We are here putting Adon. Because they don't want, when the text is read aloud, for people to say the divine name. They'd rather just use the word Adon. Adon just means Lord. Sarah calls Abraham Lord, and any person of seniority could be called Lord. Did you know if you're in a restaurant in Israel and your waiter goes by, this is a sign of respect. You know how we say, sir, 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 ma'am, excuse me, sir. That's Adon. In Israel, when you're ordering something, waiter goes by or waitress, you say, Adon, Adon. You're obviously not calling them God or anything like that, right? Adonai, though, if you put it in the plural, it's the Lord of all lords. You see the same idea. Like Elohim is the force of all forces. Adonai is the Adon of all Adon, the Adon Olam, as it's called in Hebrew liturgy. So let me put the package together for you. What you have here, what is a human being made in the image of God? A living breather. What is a fish? A living breather. What is a land animal? A living breather. What are they given once they are shaped and formed? The nishmat kaim, the breath of life. So a living breather that breathes with the breath of life, or even the breath of the spirit of life. It's not a special entity that's immortal, that comes from heaven. It's literally a biological process. I think this is more scientific. You know, atheists argue with theists, and people say, well, the nature of humans is more than just an animal. We have intellect and so forth, which we certainly do. And the people that I consult with, primarily Robert Kuhn of Closer to Truth and other brain scientists, they don't believe that a computational model of the human brain accounts for self-consciousness, morality, the inner sense of self, and so forth. That's another question. I'm talking about, are you dead or alive? You are a nephesh, and you can be a nephesh capable of self-consciousness and higher functions of the brain that are beyond our ken, really. And there might be another factor that we don't know yet, that some brain scientists and physicists talk about, a fifth force. So you have the electromagnetic force, gravity, the strong and weak nuclear forces. Those are the four, quote, physical forces. But why do we even call them physical? See, when we call them physical, we're implying like, oh, we understand those totally. We don't understand gravity, and we don't understand light. We don't, the forces, strong and weak, at the lower levels of the cosmos, when you're dealing with atoms and nuclear kinds of levels, and quantum levels. We talk about them, we can observe their behavior, but to say, oh, those are physical, that's stuff, and then there's the spiritual. I'm a monist. I think there's one reality. I think Einstein maybe taught us that, even though I'm not a physicist. Energy equals mc squared. And so the thing that we call energy is actually a form of basically a configuration of a certain behavior of the so-called physical forces. So this dichotomy, it's more dualism. Everything is dual. Now, when you say God is a spirit, you're saying, you're describing the force of all forces, which does not seem to be on a level with a being made from the dust of the earth. I don't know of any text that implies the Elohim of Elohim, or will is was, or the God of all gods, or the Adon Olam is made out of dust of the dirt. But we are made out of dust of the dirt, and we know that very well. When somebody dies, when somebody ceases to breathe their last and their brain stops functioning because of lack of oxygen, and the heart quits beating. Why? Because of lack of oxygen. And when that stops, it's over. And we all know that very well. But if you put these together, so you have human beings as totally dependent upon God or of the creative force of all forces, but biological beings, and when they die, and their bodies go back to the dust, and the breath goes forth, and the spirit of the breath goes forth, and their plans or their doings are over. They literally are taken out. Now, the Hebrew, I'm not doing this today, but the Hebrew Bible talks about that as Sheol. It's a state more than a place. Like, people think of it as you go down and you'll get in Sheol and there your soul will be. That's not the idea in the Hebrew Bible. Those who sleep in the dust is the metaphor that's used in the book of Daniel 12. If you're sleeping in the dust, you went back to the dust, your breath went forth, and you're awaiting what Daniel refers to as awakening, which later becomes standing up, which is the literal meaning of resurrection. So Ezekiel's question, can these bones live? Remember how they live? They get put back together, and the spirit is breathed upon them, and they become living beings again. It's just a recreation of Genesis. Now, if you get into questions of, well, what kind of a body will they have, and will it be the same, and all of those kind of things, that's discussed in various ways by Jews, by the Apostle Paul, by Jesus himself. He's asked about resurrection. But the biblical idea is basically that those who sleep in us will come forth. This is Isaiah 26, verse 19. It's one of the only references in the prophets, unless you consider Daniel part of the prophets, but he's really in the later part of the Hebrew Bible, where you have this idea of awakening. Thy dead shall live, their bodies shall rise, O dwellers in the dust, awake and sing for joy. For your dew is a dew of light, and on the land of the shades you will let it fall. So it's speaking to God. You have this dew of light. This is a metaphor that comes down upon the world of the dead and lightens it up. And then dwellers in the dust awake and sing for joy. That is the biblical view. And that becomes the hope of Judeo-Christianity. Now, the immortal soul is such a seductive idea that the body's nothing, the soul is everything, and surely our souls must live and go to heaven, and everybody talks across the board. And if you go to the East, Hinduism and Buddhism also are built on this idea that the body's nothing, and it's kind of unconnected to the earth, and it's your soul you really want to redeem. I call it the bad idea that's taken over the world. If you go to my YouTube channel, jamestaborvideos.com, you can listen to that video where I talk about it. Now, this should not be to people some kind of discouraging downer, because it is realism, and it's the way creation is described, and it's the way we're described. You know, some of you have lost pets that you love very much. Their breath goes forth, they return to the dust. Some of you, as I have, and I think almost all of you, have lost dear members of your family, either immediate or extended family. Their breath goes forth, they go to the dust. So what is the hope in the Hebrew Bible? It's that nothing is forgotten. Thy dead shall live, that God keeps faith with the dead, and the light is going to shine on the land of the shades. And that's where we get this whole idea in Hebrew eschatology. So Hebrew eschatology, I'll quote the New Testament here because it puts it together pretty well. When Jesus is asked by Sadducees who don't believe this, in fact, they believe when you're dead, you're dead. That's just it. And he says, no, those who are worthy to obtain that age, that period of time, and the resurrection of the dead will rise up in a new form. And that seems to be Daniel's idea too. Not that you're trying to get a corpse from somewhere and put it back together, like some people call a zombie apocalypse, making fun of it. That's not the idea at all, but rather some sort of a recreation or reestablishing of that essential person. Now, whether one believes that or doesn't believe it, I think it's important to get the ideas straight. And so in the Hebrew Bible, the idea would be when you die, you're unconscious, and your next waking moment, given this faith in resurrection, would be to wake up. Literally the next second in your time, it's likened to sleep. And maybe there's a dream state, I don't know. I hope it's good dreams if it is. Or maybe when you die, there's nothing. Some people think that, it's interesting that Ecclesiastes says, who knows? Who really knows? I'm wondering whether that's not purposeful. What kind of a religion is it that doesn't really offer people the immortal soul and eternal life? I don't know of any. I think maybe Confucianism, but is that really a religion? It's more of a system of ethics in Chinese culture. But just about anything that you would call a religion, if you look up religion, it often refers to a view, some transcendent meaning in another higher realm, often called heaven or a world beyond, whether it's nirvana or whatever. Now, original Buddhism, by the way, did not have that idea, but it develops. I think John the Baptist, Jesus, even Paul talks about those who are sleeping, and he doesn't think they have bodies. And he even says in 2 Corinthians 5, we don't want to be found naked, but we want to be reclothed with a new body. So, I'm quoting the New Testament only because those are places in the New Testament where this original Hebrew view is still being put forth. So these 5 great concepts are what we have, what we are, living breathers with the breath of life that goes forth, we go back to the dust. The force of all forces that calls Abraham to bring justice and righteousness to the nations. And that's basically the plan. What happens to the dead? Maybe Deuteronomy 29:29 is what ancient people lived with and were satisfied with, that if God is the creator and humans are made in the image of God, and the way to the tree of life was blocked in the early stories of Genesis of the garden within Eden, then that's out there. But what happens with religions a lot of times is they become about getting eternal life, of getting to heaven, about, in other words, the main question becomes, I remember in college being asked by students of various campus evangelism groups, do you know if you were to die tonight, you'd go to heaven? That was the question, rather than the question of, what about justice and righteousness filling the earth, and what are you doing to promote that? You know, it sounds kind of trivial to some people to say, well, leave this world a better place than when you came. That's pretty Hebraic. That's pretty Hebraic. And if you, through your offspring and through others you influence, if you don't have children, make the world, perfect the world, the idea of tikkun ha'olam, to fix the world, to bring it back to what it could be, because it clearly has departed in some really significant ways with our wars and our suffering and all the things that happen. That's kind of the Hebrew view. So the secret things belong to Hashem, or God, and the things that he's revealed belong to us. And I think the things that he's mainly revealed in the Hebrew Bible, at least, are get it done. You know, where there's injustice rather, establish justice. Wherever there's darkness, bring light, and so forth. And those 5 things together, I think, give the essence of the whole plan without taking any Hellenistic shortcuts to the other world. Finally, what really bothers me about that, and I'll stop now, I think it's an hour because I've had some sound problems for about 10 minutes or more. What really bothers me is if you go too much towards a dualistic idea, even though it's comforting, because it seems immediate, but what's presented here is immediate too, in these few texts on resurrection of the dead, because you awake from your sleep and you kind of rub your eyes and there you are, metaphorically speaking. But what bothers me is it separates people from the good earth and from the body and from sexuality. And it makes celibacy a virtue, and it makes asceticism a virtue, as if to deny the body and deny the flesh, as it's called, and deny the world, and seeing this world as a dark place. And we're pilgrims just passing through, and it's a horrible place. Well, it is a horrible place. But why is it a horrible place?